Olá, meu nome é Rafael Neves, sou diretor científico do Cebrap. Bem-vindo, bem-vinda a essa discussão. Hoje nós temos aqui uma discussão internacional, então eu vou ter que mudar a chavinha aqui e começar a falar inglês. So I'm very pleased to introduce this discussion, actually a book release, the release of Limits of Democracy, from the June 2013 uprisings in Brazil to the Bolsonaro government by Marcos Nobre. So I'm very pleased to introduce you these three people who will discuss Brazilian politics, crisis of democracy. Anyway, like very interesting topics today. So with us, we have Professor William Sharman, James Rudy Professor of Political Science at Indiana University at Bloomington, Professor Mariana Valente, Professor of International Law and Economics at the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland, Associate Director of Internet Lab and Researcher at Cebrap, and Professor Marcos Nobre, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Campinas, President of Cebrap. During this discussion, the editor of Springer, the publisher of the book, Bruno Fiuza, I'd like to thank Bruno for this. We are gonna post a coupon for discount if people are interested in buying the book. So, and feel free to ask questions. Para quem quiser escrever perguntas em português, fique à vontade, a gente traduz. So if one is writing in Portuguese, I can try to translate so everybody can follow the discussion. So, well, we have people from living in different continents today, so I'm very glad that we could meet here, and thank you very much for attending this discussion. So we could start with Professor Sharman.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Very much looking forward to the conversation. Good morning to those of you in Brazil. Good evening to Professor Valente. Again, very much looking forward to this. So I just would like to begin by saying that I'm absolutely delighted that my friend Marcos Nobre's very important book has been published and updated for an Anglophone audience. The book offers a series of very creative arguments that I think are going to be of interest, not just to Brazilian experts, but to many, many others with interest in democratic theory and in what many of us are now calling the crisis of democracy. We're living in frightening times, certainly as far as democracy and the rule of law are concerned. And I think Marcos is to be praised for trying to make sense of these times. And indeed, Marcos, I'll say something publicly I said to you in private at the risk of embarrassing you. I mean, I admire tremendously the way you have sort of reinvented yourself. You began in social philosophy, and yes, this is a book that is social philosophical, but it's also a lot more than that. So again, thank you very much for doing this. I think we have to do this sort of thing, given the political challenges we face. So I have one specifically political question about Brazil, but I think I'll hold off on that until the end of my remarks. First, I just would like to say why I think it's so important that we have this English edition of the book. As the book discusses, and as I'm sure anyone who's watching and participating in this debate knows, there is now a worldwide conversation about the resurgence of autocracy, authoritarianism. Different concepts are being used, different theoretical frameworks. Some people talk of illiberal democracy, some people talk of populism or authoritarian populism, others talk of the new fascism or the old fascism. I don't think we have to worry too much about these different terms and their different theoretical significances this morning. The important thing, it seems to me, for our purposes, is to point out that so much of this debate has been focused on and preoccupied with the global north. And indeed, I would say sometimes it's been narrowly Eurocentric in the worst possible sense of the term. A great deal of the debate takes as its starting point, this is at least my interpretation of the debate, small, relatively homogenous European countries. I mean, Hungary is the obvious example. Viktor Orban is sort of the poster boy for this discussion. Of course, there are understandable reasons for this, because Viktor Orban and some other European leaders have been crucial in these developments. What this has meant, unfortunately, and I do think there's a sort of lingering intellectual colonialism at work here, is that related developments in the global south, in Brazil, for example, in India perhaps as well, tend too often, not always, but too often, to get sidelined in these general theoretical debates about populism, fascism, illiberal democracy, and so on. Even more importantly, and I would say even more problematically, the possibility that autocratic trends in populist, diverse, multiracial, extremely unequal societies, developing societies, I know that term is unfashionable because it's been linked to teleological theories of modernization, but I'm going to use it without those sorts of connotations. I think one can do so. Yes, there is overlap with European cases in countries of this type, but what's happening in your country, I suspect, is taking a very different path in some ways. So I'm just making a very simple point. Brazil is not Hungary, it's not Poland, and that's going to mean something. Even, of course, there are ways in which Bolsonaro seems too often reminiscent of Viktor Orban, or perhaps Berlusconi, right? Another figure who's often mentioned, described as a forerunner to what we're seeing in your country. So I would say the most elementary, but also hugely important achievement of this book is that it calls on the Anglophone scholarly world not only to bring Brazil into the picture to a degree that hasn't happened. I mean, it has happened, but it hasn't happened enough, but to pose the question, the difficult question, of whether the case of Brazil, at least to some extent, requires a rethinking of contemporary theoretical and analytic frameworks that we're using to deal with these phenomena. So in other words, what I'm saying is it's not just a matter of, I don't know if this is going to come across, it's maybe an Americanism, I can explain it if you'd like. It's not just a matter of add Brazil and mix. We Americans have these sort of boxes of a pre-done recipe, and you add water and you have a cake. So it's not just a matter of throwing Brazil into the box. Rather, my point is that by adding Brazil, we may have to change the recipe in ways that I think at least the Anglophone debate has not sufficiently acknowledged. So in this spirit, I'll just point out that a number of the book's specific remarks about the scholarship about Brazil, I think, are probably more generally applicable to some of the things that I'm hearing in the Anglophone debate. So just two quick examples. In the spirit of critical theory, that's Marcus's home base. He probes the implicit normativity of mainstream political science and democratic theoretical discussions, of coalitional presidentialism in particular. So he points out, I think, very effectively that social scientific, presumably descriptive categories, again, coalitional presidentialism is the most important one, have come in many problematic ways to serve as a normative yardstick with all sorts of problematic political connotations. He also worries that too much of the debate about Bolsonaro tends to presuppose some pre-Bolsonaro democratic golden age, right? Some situation of democratic normalcy we should return to, the 1990s, let's say, or the 2000s. Again, as I think he very convincingly shows, this commonplace view badly obscures all the many ways in which the present crisis has its roots in long-standing trends within Brazilian politics and society. So I'm not going to get into detail, but I'll just say that I do think these arguments are directly applicable in many ways to some of the things that I'm seeing in the debates that I've been reading about. All right, so I want to raise one empirical question, one analytic one, and then a political question. Here's the empirical question, and maybe it's the least important, but I'm curious about it. So there's one matter in which I think Marcus and I may disagree. I'm not sure, so this is why I'm asking. So maybe I'm just asking for clarification. This concerns his view of the political agenda that is being advanced by what he calls the new rights, right? These different political movements on the right and parties that have came together to support Berlusconi. He says, I think quite rightly, that the rise of the global right has successfully tapped anti-feminist, racist, homophobic, and xenophobic sentiments. I agree. I think what we're seeing, or what I would describe as counter-revolutionary movements that are directed against some of the great historical achievements in Brazil and elsewhere, certainly in my country, of the women's movement, anti-racist movement, gay liberation movement, and so on. However, when Marcus goes into his discussion of these matters, he says, there's a passage that I guess irritated me just a little bit. He says that it would be a mistake to reduce the far right to an anti-movement. That's a quotation. In other words, an anti-movement directed against these liberal and left liberal movements, social movements. He says doing so might overestimate the strength of the new emancipatory movements. This is page 85, and it would leave us with a distorted picture of what's going on. So I'd love to hear more about this, Marcus. Again, I'm not sure we disagree, but I do think perhaps more than you do, at least as I read this, that some of these identity-based social and political movements have fundamentally transformed our societies. I mean, to go back to Karl Marx and the German ideology, they have resulted in changes to the real conditions of people's life. This isn't some sort of superstructure of progressive neoliberalism, okay? So maybe we can talk a little bit more about this. All right, my theoretical question. So one of the literatures Marcus taps to analyze Bolsonaro's rise comes from researchers who've been exploring digitalization. I'm sure Professor Valenti will say more about this. Marcus, I think, shows that Bolsonaro and the new rights, like their peers elsewhere, Donald Trump and his groupies in my country, have mastered these new technologies, social media and so on, in ways that more traditional political forces have not been able to do. He's inspired by the work of Paulo Gabaudo, as he should be, very important work. In that context, he views Bolsonaro as a personalistic, plebiscitarian hyper leader. This is the category Gabaudo uses, whose support within the security forces among evangelicals, petty bourgeois elements of agribusiness, retrograde members of Brazil's privileged classes with a soft spot for dictatorship, was significantly facilitated by a digitally based political mobilization that in turn, if I understand you correctly, Marcus, you want to say, depended on and simultaneously aggravated loose, decreasingly significant party ties. I mean, there's a very interesting story in the book about political parties in Brazil. So I found this discussion illuminating. It did raise one question in my mind. What exactly or precisely is novel about the autocratic right's personalistic plebiscitarianism? How is the personalistic plebiscitarian leadership that we now see out there that's so central to people such as Bolsonaro or Trump different, if it is different, from previous top-down plebiscitary style regimes that relied on a similarly personalistic style of leadership? I mean, many times Weber's category of charisma has been used, of course, to make sense of this. Now, of course, there are substantive policy differences, let's say, between Bolsonaro and one of the great political figures of your country, Vargas. And yes, ours is a different political and social world than those of our parents, our grandparents. And in that context, or in that sort of in reference to that, Marcus points out that the traditional mass media, radio, TV, newspapers, and so on have been dramatically transformed by the emergence of the new social media. And this is important for understanding what's happening now. Yet I still wasn't altogether sure at the end of the day what Marcus describes or what you have in mind with the structural change. I mean, this is an expression you use at a number of junctures in the relationship between political leadership and electorate. What exactly is that structural change? Even if you go back and look at Bernard Menin's analysis of audience democracy, which Marcus relies on quite a bit, Menin pointed to the increasingly personalized relationship between voters and political leadership. He was writing, if I recall correctly, about the 1970s. Max Weber, of course, writing over 100 years ago in these famous political writings, saw personalistic plebiscitarianism as a more or less unavoidable feature of modern mass democracy. So again, what is different, if anything, about Trump or Bolsonaro in terms of the personalism and plebiscitarianism? Okay, my political question. I think I can say this one or summarize this most concisely. So at the end of the book, Marcus describes I would say, far-reaching political and social agenda that he clearly was hoping when he finished the book last summer. I think you were putting the finishing touches on it, right? Last July or so. He was hoping a new left or center-left government in Brazil would be able to pursue. And that agenda, he pointed out, might have to rely on a coalition with conservatives, principled conservatives, who want to keep Brazil from backsliding into dictatorship. At the same time, he hoped that the perspective, or a perspective at that time, a prospective Lula government would pursue far-reaching redistributive measures, social measures, a reform of the police and the military. I mean, you make a very good argument for why this is necessary. Regulation of this digital public sphere, which in many ways is making a mess of things. And yes, some other hotly contested policies. And he argued, if I understood the argument correctly, that such reforms will require the end of Brazil's pathological coalitional presidentialism that requires these oversized party coalitions, and as a result doesn't really allow for far-reaching reform. I'm going to once again mispronounce a Portuguese word. Marcos and others have gotten used to this. I think you say pedametabismo. Is that more or less correct? This is the word you create. All right, there you go. So here we are a few months later. Your country has voted. History with a capital H has taken place, right? So I'd love to hear from you, Marcos, what you think about the prospects of this agenda given the election outcome. You know, Lula was narrowly elected. Unfortunately, the right and indeed the far right, if I understand correctly, has been invigorated both in the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. I mean, Bolsonaro's party did quite well there. So it's pretty difficult, at least for me as an outsider, and I hate to say this because it is the holiday season and you don't want to end on a discouraging note, to see how the Lula government is going to be able to achieve even modest reformist measures, let alone break with pedametabismo. There's a couple of brief comments in the final chapter about my president, Joe Biden. And I think Marcos points out quite rightly that Biden's agenda has been modest in some ways. I agree with this, although some things happened after you finish the book, which perhaps what might lead one to modify that a little bit. At any rate, Lula is going to face an even more inhospitable political constellation in the legislature than Biden has faced in his first 2 years. So at the risk of concluding not only on a pessimistic note, but a note that will sound like the usual gringo arrogance, I hope it doesn't, it seems to me Lula may be lucky if he can achieve what Biden has achieved in 2 years. And this is not schadenfreude. I'm not happy about this. I'm very disappointed. I sympathize with the proposed reforms, Marcos, but I'm worried. So I'm hoping you can alleviate my worries and maybe we can leave this conversation in an appropriate holiday spirit. How's that? All right. So thank you all very much. Looking forward to Professor Valenti's comments.
Thank you, Professor Scheuermann. Professor Valenti.
Thank you. Thank you, Rafael, so much. Thank you first, Marcos, and thank you, Rafael, for the invitation. I had the chance to read the manuscript of the book in Portuguese before it was released, and it was really great to read again months later. And it felt quite different this time after the elections passed, not reading a book in despair, not knowing what would come next. I mean, the general feeling of the discussion of the manuscript was pretty hard. Of course, we still don't know what comes next, as we were discussing just now, right? But I think we can say there are fewer gloomy options ahead, perhaps. So my very short contribution here will be based on picking up some elements. I'm thinking especially of listeners who didn't read the book yet, and then, sorry, of course, there will be some spoilers. And then I'll also selfishly drive the conversation to listen to you, Marcos, about what you think comes next. So I guess in Bill's classification, I'll make some political questions as well. And I'm very happy to be with you here too, Bill. I've been following your work. I think it's the first opportunity I have of sharing the same space. It's a pleasure. And glad to hear your words. I think they're a first confirmation of how important it is to have an English edition of this book. It speaks a lot to its importance. And I'm also very happy that such a good account of the case of Brazil's crisis of democracy is out there to be recommended to English speakers. So going to some points about the book. I think Limits of Democracy is a book that establishes a close dialogue with contemporary political theory and provides interpretation of developments in the field of democracy in Brazil in the past decade. And similar to what Bill was saying, it's connected to overarching theorizations, but it's grounded, very much grounded in Brazil's internal developments and in the characteristics of Brazil's political system and political culture. And in my view, what's really great about Limits of Democracy is that it provides an interpretation of the meaning of 2013 when the mass uprisings happened in Brazil and the following developments leading to the election of Jair Bolsonaro and then his government until now. And it does that by rejecting simplistic explanations that either try to paint it, 2013, right, as necessarily leading to a conservative turn, or that completely excuse the progressive stakeholders then in power. I think it also encompasses for this complex interplay between global and local economics, politics, political culture, and this new technological and communications landscape. And then also for future readers, I don't think it's a simple book because the issue is complex, but it's a remarkable weaving of different threads. And I think it's a powerful contribution to our coming to terms with June 2013 uprisings in this new moment, and for whoever wants to understand these latest developments in Brazil. But I'd like to argue that there's one more point of interest in the book, and I think I'm there like also in dialogue with Bill, that there's like a contribution to a wider discussion that's about Brazil, but that's not just about Brazil. So for anyone who's interested in understandings around this interplay between tech and democracy, which is one of my major interests in the book, of course, because of my research focus, the book provides an interpretation that adds additional layers to important discussions on the issue, therefore next to authors like Rodrigo Nunes, Paulo Gerbaldo, Ralf Schroeder, Giovanni da Empoli. And it draws also from some of the most important and interesting accounts of the latest developments in political culture in Brazil. So Camila Rocha writing about the new rights, Jonas Medeiros and Fabiola Fanti writing about feminist counterpublics, and other accounts of what happened since 2013, like Consuelo Diegues and many others. And then thinking again of those who didn't read, just a short explanation about how these digital technologies come for in this discussion. So in Marco's book, digital technologies are not just a digital tool used by political stakeholders, but it changes the very nature of democracy and shakes the party system. So Marcos here draws from Bernard Manan's characterization of the developments from party democracy to audience democracy in the 60s and 70s, and argues that now we're witnessing a new form of democracy. And of course, this is an ideal type. Differences are to be felt everywhere, but step by step, audience democracy there refers to fundamental changes in campaigns and in the representation tie, according to Manan, due to changes in political communication enabled by the television, especially. And according to that author, the nature of the campaigns changed because of how television offered a new platform for mass communication that allowed for things like exploring personalities, traits, image, and they also changed the so-called representation tie. He's also referring to how previous cleavages like class are not a given for audience democracy like they were for previous party democracy, that now new cleavages can be proposed by politicians and parties using these new means, and that the audience is not so obvious anymore. So it had to be built. And this is a discussion that's important because Marcos is arguing here that decades later, digital technologies also promote fundamental changes. And I think that also plugs into the question that Bill posed about what the fundamental change there is. So it would be good to listen to Marcos speak about this. But what he writes in the book is that they have to do with a fragmentation of publics that happens in social media, on digital technologies, through these new frontiers of data analytics, that is using data algorithms to know your electorate in detail and explore these micro publics, things that were not possible before digital technologies. The development of different and closer relationships between representatives and represented. Then we're thinking, for example, of when, even before anyone could imagine him being president, Bolsonaro was participating in WhatsApp groups and building a digital audience himself personally. and many commentators, many observers have been writing about how this had a role in his growth from a small representative to one of the most important politicians in the country. And something that Marcos recognizes that needs more discussion in the future, which is the nature of this new reintermediation, and I'll speak of it in a bit. But what I found central in the points he makes is that, first, parties born digital find it, of course, way easier to navigate this new environment. He's here drawing also from Gerbaldo. And Marcos proposes that an analysis of this moment in Brazil requires understanding at least that. So first, Brazil did not witness this audience democracy that Manan's speaking of, because it was going through a military dictatorship when the TV popularized, and therefore Brazil had neither audience nor democracy. And then second, the turn to the digital happened in an age of a newly established democracy, 1988, and the emergence of new social actors, social movements from the left to the right. And then in the end, that in Brazil, digital technologies were adapted at the same time very fast and very unequally. I think what Marcos is saying here somehow is that 2013 shocked observers or left them prostrated because these developments came to full visibility all at once, and the system was incapable to adapt to the demands that were coming from the streets, but also incapable to digitize, right? So important here is that everything that happened were not just a natural development, right? It's not a natural development that the extreme right would occupy these new digital avenues in the country, although, of course, some affinities are to be observed. Many people have been writing about that. But it is what happened. And then Bolsonarismo emerges as this digital party, where it's not that the traditional party structures are relevant, but they did not have the same role, and they were hacked by this Bolsonarismo, right? And a sign of that is that Bolsonaro himself did not have a party for 2 years while he was in power. So he relied on permanent engagement, and his digital publics were central for that. And then, of course, technology develops usually before any regulation and controls are put in place, but this mismatch was massive in this case. And then we reached 2018, seeing this massive phenomenon, a winning Bolsonarismo built predominantly online, a president winning with almost no television time. So that speaks a lot to the change of times, right? But also, and then I find this very important to highlight, this, and then I'm speaking a little bit freer from the book now. Bolsonaro did not use exactly the same techniques that Trump did in the past, right? I think even if we're looking at a broader phenomenon, it's very important that we are not so eager to go on finding that it's all one and the same thing with one big planner behind it. There's like a centralization in this movement, right? Of course, there are important stakeholders behind, people who think of how to use digital technology, Steve Bannon, for example. But I think the 2018 elections in Brazil really shows that different techniques can be used and adapted to different contexts. So, for example, Bolsonaro did not use micro-targeting on Facebook. That was the huge scandal in the Trump's election, right? The Cambridge Analytica. He was using WhatsApp for his communications, and that has to do very much with how technology is used in Brazil, how WhatsApp is in 99% of the devices of people who have access to the internet. And then I also think it's really important to discuss how the current social media affordances have proven to be really useful for anti-system demands and organizations. And then there's a discussion on this in the book as well, because attention is central there for these business models. Tim Wu is an author that's telling us that our attention is what's being sought on social media all the time. Marcos discusses with that a little bit, so that we spend more time on social media, which drives, of course, advertisers. It's where the profits are. But again, it's really important to see that this is not necessarily a given, right? I was listening once to a Jack Dorsey's interview. Jack Dorsey was Twitter's founder and CEO before all the Elon Musk mess. And he was grieving over some algorithmic choices that Twitter did in the beginning, like, for example, giving more weight to liking and sharing and making something visible to people instead of other things. So, for example, meaningful engagement, right? Instead of making it that when someone shares and comments and engages meaningfully with content, that content becomes more apparent. So these little decisions prove to be very important in shaping the online public environment. And in their turn, they're also appropriated by users, right? So I think that complex interplay is really important to come forth. I was reading this recent article by Professor Fernanda Rosa, who is proposing something interesting, a code ethnography, because she's understanding that code is a socio-technical actor in these discussions, right? And I find this absolutely relevant to move these discussions forward, to understand the nature of this new intermediation, and therefore to make the right questions. And I think this is an avenue that your book, Marcos, opens for many future discussions on this. And then finishing my intervention here, I'd like to leave you, Marcos, with two of these questions. You dwell on them on your conclusions a bit. But I'm referring to what's there to fix and what's there to occupy when it comes to digital technologies, right? Fix, I mean, as in regulating the internet. There have been some recent internet regulation initiatives. You mentioned them in your book. So, for example, this whole movement in Europe around regulating platforms, so the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and they seem to place a lot of faith in interoperability and transparency, and that certainly doesn't seem enough. And we've discussed this. I'm a bit suspicious of the model of concession that you propose when it comes to tech, but it would be good to listen to you again on that. Or on the other hand, occupy as in not merely containing, right, these technologies. I wonder what the future looks like with Lula's victory in that respect. Do we only need to contain this superpower of technologies, or do we need to think of other forms of occupying it as well? And then I'm thinking that the reports being released by the transition groups working for the government transition right now point to the necessity of regulating social media on the one hand. So when you look at the communications working group, this is something they're very clearly proposing. And then on the other hand, also understanding this occupying social media thing. I was reading news about the education working group report, and they're speaking of monitoring the extreme right online and understanding how these things work. And I'd love to hear what you make of this all and of the future. So thank you all. Thank you so much for the opportunity of being here.
Thanks a lot, Mariana. Marcos?
Thanks, Rafael. I really don't know how to thank you, Bill and Mariana and Rafael for the time, for the effort to discuss my book. I'm really honored and very, very happy. It's a lot. It's a lot for me. I don't know if I'll be able to react properly to all the questions you put. They are all very central and decisive, but I'll try to. When you were talking about not just adding Brazil to the box, Bill, I think this is crucial, because to develop this idea would mean to go into details, into so many aspects. It wouldn't be possible. But I would like just to share an idea, a general idea, which maybe it's important for people who are listening to us and who will read the book. to have one thing. In the Brazilian case, there is a coincidence between redemocratization and the rise of neoliberalism. It didn't happen in other countries where democracy survived during the second half of the 20th century. That was not our case from 64 to 85. So this may explain a lot about neoliberalism and about its democratic form. For instance, just to give people an idea of what is at stake. And I think that Brazil only went global in this terrible sense because it's a global movement, this new authoritarianism. So if it was only Brazil, then people wouldn't care. Although they should, I think. But if we go through the point on which you said, Bill, that we may disagree, you were irritated by that passage, and I mean, this is right. You should be, because this is a kind of a provocation. And what do I mean by that? First, when I'm talking about the new rights, I'm talking about something very different from the far right. So these movements, maybe they just disappeared now in Brazil. Maybe they don't have the size they had before, like in 2016 or 17, and maybe they just amalgamated with Bolsonarismo. Maybe they went to the opposition to Bolsonaro, but they don't have the protagonism they once had. So I will make a difference between the new rights and the far right. And specifically in the case of the far right, when you say that there is an opposition between understanding the far right by itself, so to say, and negatively, that is to say, as anti-emancipatory. When you have this opposition, you also have the classical problem of defining something by the negative, and that's what I don't want to do. I don't want only to characterize the far right as a counter-revolutionary movement, because I think that we don't understand it in the detail if we do that. And there is also this danger of let's say over-evaluating the forces of emancipatory movements by saying that we are so strong that they had to react. I'm not saying in any way that it's not a reaction. It's also a reaction. But if we don't understand why people vote for Bolsonaro, for instance, if we don't understand it deeply, we won't be able to get out of this situation. And this implies not saying that they are just reacting. So that was the idea. I don't know if it's enough. We can discuss it further. I understand that when you ask about the difference between the 1920s and the 2020s, so to say, this 100 years difference between the classical, so to say, personalist authoritarian leaders and today's personalist authoritarian leaders. I would say there are many differences, but maybe I could stress 2 points that also were raised by Mariana, and I think they are very important. First of all, I think there is a kind of engagement of the basis of the electorate. It's a kind of participatory charisma, if you allow me to use such an expression, that alters the general framework. In some, I would say that agency changes in this case. And this is also important when we think about the possibility of segmenting the audiences. This is something very, very new and very effective. How to manage, so to say, different groups and audiences. By doing that, on the one hand, you reinforce the figure of the leader as a vanishing point. And this idea, the idea that the leader is a vanishing point of the structure, is very important. Why? Because, as Mariana said, it's not about the leader, it's about the network. So this is different. This is a kind of charisma that's not the classical charisma. It's the network itself that is important and not the leader. In this sense, the leader is the vanishing point of a network. And that's important. I don't know if you agree with this idea, but I would say these 2 points for us to discuss. There are others, important ones, I think. And about the political questions, because there is also from Mariana and from you, there are some political questions, very difficult ones. Of course, when I finished the book, we didn't have the election, we didn't know the result, but I was hoping that we could avoid the worst, and we could elect a democratic and committed left leader. What changed, or what new elements came into this equation? I think that the first one was the United Front in Defense of Democracy has formed. And this is after I finished the book. So I was like for 4 years crying out with all the lungs I had that we needed this United Front, that it would not be easy to defeat Bolsonaro. And in the end, really in the end, in August, when you were in Brazil, Bill, and you saw this movement yourself with your own eyes, that this United Front in Defense of Democracy formed. But this United Front in Defense of Democracy is a political one. It's not an electoral one. And they shouldn't be mixed up, in my view. And because elections are not enough to defend democracy. And you have to have both. But in the process, it was a very fast process. From August to the election in October, this United Front transformed itself into an electoral front in support of Lula. So this was very important too. But after the election, after Lula is in power on the 1st of January, this United Front, of course, it must be there to defend democracy, because Bolsonaro won't just vanish in the air. He will be there. But it won't be this united front as a front that will be in Lula's government. So what is important in the comparison with Joe Biden, I think, is that you can win an election with an united front in defense of democracy, but you cannot govern with this united front. This is impossible. You have to choose, and you have to make choices. And this is the major challenge of Lula's government, of his first year, I mean, because it was also the big challenge of Joe Biden, in my view, of his first year in power. That is to say, when you don't have an oversized coalition, which is my hope, still my hope, that Lula won't build a super coalition, a super majority. This doesn't mean that you cannot have different political positions in the ideological spectrum in the government. Quite the opposite. But this means also that this government will only have a phase, a final phase, after, let's say, 1 year, when these forces will be in conflict and something will come out of it. So, Mariana, I don't know if all the plans that are being made now by this transition team, if they will stand, because as you know, this transition team is huge. There are so many people working on so different themes. I mean, this is good that we have so many ideas, so many possibilities. At the same time, it will be complicated to make a synthesis of all this, to make them go together. And this will be the battleground of the first year of Lula's government. This is one side of the problem. The other side of the problem is that many people now are hoping that Bolsonaro is out of the picture. And I think this is naive. This is just not understanding what is really going on in Brazil. This is just not understanding what this network of Bolsonarismo means. It's very well organized. It's financially autonomous, and it's engaging, mobilizing. It's very powerful. And they won't just play by the book, because they don't have any commitment to democracy. So they will make a disloyal opposition. And this will be very, very tough. So when we think about the difficult questions you put to me regarding platforms, Mariana, or tax reform and police and armed forces reforms bill, as you said, it will be, of course, very difficult. But I think that the tax reform will go through. Maybe not in the form that we hoped, but it will go through, and it must go through. And it's also very important that we think in Brazil about a portion of the electorate that voted for Bolsonaro, but is not authoritarian. We know that something like 15% of the population is the hardcore of Bolsonarismo, really authoritarian portion of the electorate. But there are still some 33% of the electorate that voted for Bolsonaro, and they are not authoritarian. And our challenge is to to bring these people back to democracy. And we will do that not only by discourse, but by policies, making sound policies. To give you a very concrete example, the Workers' Party, PT, is very has a lot of technology when it comes to helping the most poor, the poorest people in the country. So let's say between 1 and 2 minimum wages. We have the technology, and we will go on reaching to this portion of the electorate. But this portion who earn between 2 and 5 minimum wages, they feel just helpless. They feel that the state is not with them. And major challenges to reach these people, not only with the discourse in defense of democracy or saying that evangelicals are to be praised as Brazilians as much as other religions are and everything. This is important, but we have to have sound public policies for this portion of the electors so that they can come back to democracy, even choosing right-wing leaders that are democratic. Of course, that's not the point. But there are still many questions that you raised, but I already talked too much. So I think maybe I should stop here and hear you again.
Thank you so much, Marcos. We still have some time left. We reached almost an hour of discussion. So maybe Bill and Mariana want to react to Marcos' answers. So we can start with Bill and then go back to Mariana.
Yeah, and Marcos, those are great comments. So, and I don't know, I don't have much of a response. I guess one thing, it's more of an observation, so much of what we're talking about in terms of the contours of these movements being anti-movements. The way I would put this in American English is what's the there? Like, what's the substance beyond them being anti-movements? I mean, you have very, very similar debates about classical fascism. If you go back and start reading that literature, right? People say, oh, it's, these are anti-liberal, anti-democratic, anti-socialist movements as they mimic the languages of those movements, right? So this is actually very, very interesting that way. I feel like we're sort of repeating history in maybe a strange way. And I guess that speaks to one point I would make, again, maybe we don't disagree, but my sense listening to you is that, yes, there are these things that really are novel. I mean, I like what you said about the segmented audiences and networks. This is very, very different in some ways, right? In terms of it. But that may be a point about the way in which technologies are being used or are crucial to these movements. And maybe that isn't, that is important, right? But there are some other things that you were saying that I'm still not so sure or so new. So for example, you say there's sort of an engaged basis. These are participatory. This is participatory movements. This was true of mass movements of the authoritarian right in mid-century. This is something that terrified many people, right? That, you had people on the streets actively involved. Fascism mobilized people in a way that liberal democracies often did not, right? So that itself isn't new. So I guess if I do have a response, the response would be, and maybe again we agree, it seems to me what we're seeing is, these figures, these movements, they have one foot, if you will, I don't know if this is the right metaphor, in a new world. And there are some things we really have to take seriously. But then there's still this other foot stuck in the old world where it looks very familiar, perhaps, to older, more familiar types of personalistic, plebiscitarian authoritarianism. Even the one place where I understand what you're saying about the leader vanishes, but that also irritates me a bit. There's a way in which these figures, I can't speak to Bolsonaro. I can talk about Trump. I mean, he does, the Weberian terminology here is right on the mark. You know, there's this weird way in which he seems to have a kind of magical power or magical relationship. It is a social relationship. Charisma is not something you have. It's a social relationship. But there's something going on there between leaders and followers, which at times to me looks very much like something very old-fashioned, you know. And I don't think, right, and that's going on alongside of what you're talking about, you know, the ways in which digitalization, other novel developments give this a very different sort of gloss. But my hunch is a lot of these people are not necessarily even on social media, right? And they show up at his rallies and, you know, they would love to go up and pat the great man on the back, touch him, you know, touch the godlike figure. So yeah, I mean, I again, I'm not sure we're agreeing, disagreeing, but maybe maybe I'll try to make it into a provocation. Maybe there's a danger that we do exaggerate or overstate some of the novelties here, you know. And and so that's really all I would have to say. I mean, yeah, great comment. So thank you again.
Thank you, Bill. May I just react, because this is Mariana's field. So then I'll pass to her to explain to us what's going on. But when I made agency, Bill, in this case, I'm saying that the structure is different in the sense that it's really much faster than it was before, and you have a kind of plebiscitary consultation that is permanent. This is really different. This is a way of managing the basis that didn't exist before, in the sense that just to give you an example, the extreme right, it doesn't have the fear of they don't have the fear to improvise and to make tests. They test all the time. They do try and error all the time. There is, for instance, an index that was put forward by a startup in Brazil. That they have an index. So when Bolsonaro's posts, they are rejected by more than 30% of the followers. They change the position. If they are supported, they reinforce the message. So you have this kind of management that is really instantly made. And this gives also the basis, an idea of agency that is different, that they are really influencing the leader, and they are being heard and they are being represented. It's a different kind of managing the charismatic figure, I think. That's my impression. But this is Mariana's field, so let's hear her.
What a challenge. I think that's one of the hardest questions, and I actually like the spirit of skepticism, Bill, because I think there is a lot of, it's a moment when everything, we blame tech for everything, and there's a lot of panics over things. I think this is something that at Cebrap we have been discussing a lot, right? How to strike, not the balance, but how to find, right, what the real role of technology is in processes. And I think the skepticism is really useful because first, tech is not just about disinformation, manipulation, right? And this is also why I was asking about occupying tech. I think in all this work about counterpublics, and when we're thinking, even going to your discussion, Bill, on whether these new rights are reacting to something, what is that something, right? And that something has a lot to do with networked activism and new issues that started to be part of the public sphere. Yes, very much connected to this new communicational horizon, right? So first part, I think that's really important. And second, I think you're right that many things that are pointed out as new are not new. At the same time, I think that we also run the risk of not taking this huge transformation fully into account, and how it's fully transformed society. So when you look at media consumption, for example, it's striking, right? When you look into the numbers of how people get informed. I was actually last week talking to a journalist and I asked, how do you manage to still like read the newspaper every day? And she said, I don't. I just can't. It's just like an information overload, and the ways that people are getting informed is just another way. And I think that produces a very deep transformation in society. And of course, it does transform politics as well. But then, like concretely, I think all this discussion on the importance of parties that you bring is important, of course. It has been the case in the past that parties were not so central, right? But I do think there's something new here when we think of a candidate that didn't have a party for 2 years, right? Or that's using like a network of people occupying multiple parties, like happened in Brazil in the past years, right? The Bolsonarismo was not in one party. It was like spread using different parties as houses for them, which shows that their organization or their basis was somewhere else, right? And I think that this speaks for a big difference as well. So I don't know, just also understating this, I think also has to do with a feeling that I have that there's a general feeling that maybe this whole social media thing will just go away, you know? And I'm not referring to you, not at all. I just think that in the debate sometimes that's kind of the background, you know? I don't know, maybe in like a few years, nobody will be using Facebook or Twitter and we'll be just like talking to each other again or something like that. I think this is really here to stay, even if transformed, right? And that it's not just parties and politicians that have not fully taken this into account. I was also listening to a podcast with a fact checker last week, Cristina Tatakila from Agência Lupa, and she was speaking of how she feels that traditional media also is acting as if we were not on an era of social media, you know. So for example, reporting on disinformation, it really requires a new understanding, right, of the role of media when we're thinking of viralization schemes. And so yeah, I don't think I have a good answer for your question, because it's one of the most difficult questions, because that's the issue, right? What's new and what's to be addressed, but just raising some points referring to that, perhaps you would like to react. And then Marcos, just to quickly circle something that you said. I like it very much when you're saying that maybe we're not understanding the full extent of the Bolsonarismo, its networked aspect, right? And then when I'm thinking of the tactics, I think they're also not going away. And we're having perhaps a truce, but this is something that is definitely going to be very present in Brazil in the coming years, and I think in the world in many places in the coming years. And I wonder also what will be left in the case of Brazil after all this moment of like Supreme Court investigations, decisions, electoral court decisions, which were very central to central in 2022, but are also not sustainable in the long term, right? Like this kind of acting. So yeah, many questions ahead.
Thank you. Marcos, if you want to make like final remarks. Thank you so much.
I just want to thank again you, Mariana, and you, Rafael, for organizing this and to be with us here to discuss the book. The challenges that your interventions raised, they are really big, and I couldn't even try to address all of them here, but I hope that people who are watching us now and who will watch us in the future, they will have a lot to think about. So thank you so much. It's great to see you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you,
Good to
guys.
see you all.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.